Is your TV really watching everything you do?
And do you need a slice of the new Raspberry Pi?
Welcome to Vertical Hold, the tech show where we channel surf through the headlines in search of the big picture. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm joined by a man who's planning to be Australia's first entry in the Eurovision Song Contest, Adam Turner. Adam, what's new in tech?
Samsung's Gear VR virtual reality headset is coming to Australian sales for $250, although you'll need to allow another grand because it only works with Samsung's Galaxy Note 4 phablet. At the other end of the scale, LG has gone the Google Cardboard approach with its G3. When you buy a G3, you get a free plastic frame which you can slip the smartphone into to use virtual and augmented reality.
Foxtel's announced the details of its combined pay TV, broadband and telephone bundles. It's using Telstra's infrastructure, and compared against Telstra it's slightly cheaper, with the added dangling carrot that Foxtel's internet services, so Presto and Foxtel Play, will be quota free if you're a Foxtel broadband customer. It's worth checking your sums though, because as bundles go, it's still not all that competitive against other ADSL providers.
Disney has hinted at the prospect of a Star Wars and Marvel streaming service as it thinks about cutting out the middleman and going direct to the public. It's not alone. HBO is launching its own streaming service in April to coincide with the return of Game of Thrones, a new streaming service that won't require a home HBO subscription.
Vodafone's announced that it's concluded trials of voice over LTE, and it hopes to bring that service to consumers as an Australian first before the end of the year. It's also announced that it'll move into offering shared plans across multiple SIMs and hinted at content deals around video streaming. With Netflix due to launch very, very soon, a lot of rumours are swirling around, but Vodafone's keeping that relatively quiet.
So, Alex, you say Vodafone's talking about voice over LTE. I understand the concept, but I don't really know much about the implementation. What are you actually getting with voice over LTE as opposed to just a normal phone call?
Well, the big advantages for voice over LTE are meant to be call quality, but they always say that.
Yeah.
The proof will be in the pudding there. But also the fact that you don't actually drop down to 3G for calls. And this affects, of course, everything else that your phone is doing. So you're not going down to a slower and potentially more congested band when a call comes in. That's the big selling point for them. LTE wasn't actually developed with voice in mind at all. 3G as a standard was voice and data and everything else it can do. LTE was meant to be just data. So this is a bit of a bolt-on, which is really kind of why we haven't seen it from the other existing players. It's still an interesting thing for Vodafone to be going into, considering there are other areas like 700 megahertz, for example, where it doesn't hold spectrum, and it's got a bit of an uphill battle, I think, in the Australian marketplace.
So the advantage for the end user is that you spend less on phone calls but spend more on data?
No, the advantage is you get better phone calls in theory, again, have to wait and see for that. But anything else that your phone is doing in the background, it's still doing over LTE.
Oh, okay. So, but do you think most people understand that, or do they just think it's a VoIP call?
I don't think it's going to have massive traction. I think they're going to have an interesting time overall selling the concept, which is why I think that actually what they'll do is they'll go in and they'll sell it on the voice quality thing. Yeah. Nothing sucks more than having a poor quality mobile call and then being able to say, well, we have this technology, and as long as you've got a compatible handset, and most of the premium handsets from 2014 should be able to handle voice over LTE. So if you're an iPhone 6 user or a Note 4 user, for example, you're fine. If you're still holding on to your iPhone 3, then yeah, not so much.
So Alex, it seems that not only the walls have ears, but also the televisions have ears. There's talk that Samsung televisions are listening in on everything we say. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's an interesting story. This one blew up quite recently because it was revealed that Samsung TVs, which have a voice activation feature, and lots of things these days have voice activation features, but the way it does that, and the way in fact most of these do it, is that your voice is captured and then it's sent off to an external processing site. In Samsung's case, they use Nuance Communications, who are the people behind Dragon Dictate, if you've ever used that. And they use that to then work out, right, well, what is it you're saying, what is it you want the TV to do? It then sends it back to the TV and it then, changes channel or whatever you've told it to do. What was kind of unveiled in their policy was the fact that, actually it is listening, And so, if you're talking about your affair with the next door neighbour's wife, then technically speaking, that stuff is also going up to nuance. And this got people understandably a bit concerned. Samsung's put out a statement to say that, they respect their users' privacy. And it's the usual kind of thing. But this has then reignited that whole debate about how much privacy we have, or we should have, or we should trade away in the internet age. And it's not always, in my estimation, it's not always an absolutely equal bargain.
Well, it's not like it's going out to a person in a call centre somewhere who's listening to it, taking notes and sending it back. It sounds like it's all being done automatically and very quickly. So while technically, yes, there is a privacy invasion because your conversation is going elsewhere, realistically, there's not someone sitting there tapping in on the line listening to every word. So I think most people, if they look at it, you would hope not. Yeah, you would think that most people would, when they look at it that way, wouldn't worry about it. But I mean, mentioning ASIO is a good one, because we do know that pretty much any device with a microphone can be hacked and turned into a listening device. And I'm sure right now there are people at the NSA and other interesting organisations around the world looking at how you can hack into these devices and use them to listen to everything that's going on in the room. So if you really are concerned about your privacy, if you're in the mob or whatever, maybe get yourself a dumb television, not a smart television would be my recommendation.
You can switch this particular feature off, to be fair to Samsung. And it's not just the is your device about to be hacked kind of thing, because there's also the worry that if this data is stored on an external server, what happens if they have a security breach as well? So there's multiple levels at which people get concerned. And I think, here there's a trade-off, because there's an obvious trade-off for convenience. You're saying, right, well, I want to be able to talk to my TV and tell it to change channel, and that's kind of nice and cute when it works and really frustrating when it doesn't.
Yes.
But there's at least a trade-off. You're at least getting something for it. I don't hold a whole lot of trust. Some of the defences of it have essentially just been, if you've got nothing to hide, then you've got nothing to worry about. And I'm not sure I 100% agree with that, because I think, especially given how hyper-connected we are these days, privacy should be really kind of first and foremost in a lot of people's minds, because it should be one of those rights that we actively do fight for, whether it's in this small scale way, and I do agree this is a small scale story, or it's in a much bigger thing, metadata retention or something like that. There's still the same fight. It's still privacy. It's just privacy against a government versus privacy against a big business organisation. And the reality with a lot of big businesses, and I'm not just having a go at Samsung here, Apple does exactly the same thing with Siri, for example.
Yeah.
But and Google now does the same kind of stuff. The reality is that businesses will go as far as they can get away with. Adam, the Raspberry Pi 2's just been announced. Now, this is meant to be a low-cost computer, largely for education. What does the sequel bring that the original didn't have?
Well, at first glance, not a lot. Here, I've got my small prop, because it's not the size of your props, it's what you do with it. But I've got my small prop.
I've got my big prop, but this is the Raspberry Pi 1. It's clearly, it's old junk. I'm just going to have to throw it away.
Well, this is the Raspberry Pi 2, and the big differences are that it now has a quad-core processor, and it has a gig of RAM, which means it's a lot faster. But the big change is that it's also a newer type of processor. It used to be an ARM6, and now it's an ARM7. And what that means is it can run new kinds of software that it couldn't run before, but some of the software that would run on the old one's going to need an upgrade. So they've sort of created a bit of fragmentation, but it was necessary to take it to the next level. One of the things is that they're hoping there'll be a version of Windows 10 they know there will be a version of Windows 10 that will run on this, and the reason why that will work is because they've gone for the new processor. And the amazing thing is it's still at basically that $40 price that the original one was, so it's pretty good value for money when you consider what you're getting.
But it's still, as I said in the intro, the original was designed from the ground up, in fact, as an educational computer. I've interviewed the people behind it. Are they still pushing it that way, or have they kind of admitted, yeah, look, the hobbyists have really taken this one over?
Well, it's like all new cheap things. Netbooks were meant to be aimed at, the developing world and the education market, and then first world geeks like us went, oh, that looks cool, I'll have 3. And I think the Raspberry Pi has kind of gone the same way. For every kid there is out there who's using it to learn the program, there's a dozen nerds who have one to run a robotics program or a media server, or I've got one running an arcade coffee table. So I think that really is their primary market. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are classrooms out there where for $40 they just get one for everybody and say, let's do a bit of programming.
Fair enough. Now, the programming side of that, of course, for the original Raspberry Pi was entirely Linux-based, and there were bunches of distributions, as you say. There were arcade machine distributions, and there were full-on programming distributions, and you know, it's Linux. You name it, there's a flavour of it. But this new model, as you mentioned before, has this kind of push towards Windows. Now, that's an interesting play from Microsoft. Why would they do it?
Yeah, it is an interesting play. Part of it is because Microsoft sort of turned around a bit under the new leader, Nadella, and they're a bit more open. They realise that Microsoft isn't too big to fail anymore. It's not the centre of the universe anymore. So they're making more of an effort to get...
Shh, they'll hear you.
Yeah, no, they have actually heard people. That's the big thing, is they actually seem to get it now. It's really interesting times for Microsoft, and so they realise that Office is going to be their big cash cow into the future, especially as a lot of people will get Windows 10 for free. So Office is their big money spinner. So they're working harder to get decent versions of Office on Android, on iOS, and they're also looking at getting Windows on more devices. Now, the Windows 10 that runs on the Raspberry Pi is not going to be the Windows 10 that runs on your average desktop or notebook, because it's going to run on an ARM processor, not a standard Intel processor. What you're basically going to get is something like the Surface RT, so a stripped down version of Windows, which sucked when you were paying...
I'm shuddering already.
Yeah, that sucked when you were paying
that
$500 for a notebook that had a stripped down version of Windows that didn't do half the things you wanted Windows to do. But when you're getting it for free on a $40 piece of hardware that can also do other things, then there's a lot of upside to that. So I can't see people using it as a programming platform. I couldn't see people probably using it as a desktop replacement running Windows 10. It probably won't have enough grunt. I think it'll be more an Internet of Things, an embedded device sort of play, and just an opportunity to expand. But also for Microsoft, it drives a bit of a wedge into the Raspberry Pi ecosystem. Look at the early netbooks were all Linux. And then Microsoft decided to play down to those netbooks and get into the netbook space, and after a while...
And say, hey, you can have Windows XP for free if you bundle it, and everyone did.
Yeah, and then people were like, well, why would I want a Linux one?
The big difference there, though, was that was Windows XP, and yeah, look, it ran like a snail on a netbook.
Yeah.
But it ran, and it was still full Windows XP.
Yeah.
I wonder how genuinely useful... I get where you're coming from with the wedge thing, but I wonder how genuinely useful it's going to be if it's ARM-based. The biggest problem I had with the Surface RT was the fact that every single app that you had for it had to be built around programming concepts. So all the legacy apps, all the stuff that makes Windows what it is and gives it that kind of rich user base of apps, that's all kind of gone. Now, unless they're building into the ARM version of Windows 10 some kind of x86 compiler so that the old apps can run, you're still going to have this kind of Windows 10 in name only visual thing, which I guess is great if you just want that Windows 10 desktop look and experience and you're happy to do everything in a browser and on the web and so on. That could be fine. But if you want to do anything more, you're very quickly going to find, oh, this is a Windows 10 app, but I'm not running Windows 10 on an x86, so I'm a bit screwed, aren't you?
Yeah, pretty much. Like I said, if you're expecting it to be a full Windows 10 desktop replacement, you're going to be disappointed.
And in that, within that context, then Linux on this, in fact, might make more sense. You might be able to do more because it'll be an ARM-based Linux, and those are well understood, and the apps are kind of already out there.
Well, this new one is actually probably better as a Linux desktop, because even the first Raspberry Pis, which were a lot less powerful than this one, they would struggle with a Linux desktop if you wanted to do too much at once. And I've got the first Raspberry Pi, I've got the second one, which was an intermediary step with more RAM in it, and now I've got this new one with a faster processor and more RAM. And you can really see the jump in the desktop performance when you run something like Raspbian, which is a Linux desktop designed to run on the Pi. So if you tried the first Raspberry Pi as a desktop replacement and went, no, it just can't keep up when I try to do two things at once, it's definitely worth looking at the new Linux ones. But if you really push your... it's definitely worth looking at the new Raspberry Pi with more grunt. But if you really push your computer to the limit, you might find that it's still not quite the desktop replacement that you're looking for.
So Adam, as an avowed geek, and to finish up, what are you going to do with your Raspberry Pi 2?
Well, I'm going to see if I can run the same arcade software that I run on my current Raspberry Pi, because it runs a lot of emulators, and some of the higher end games and the higher end emulators still struggle because it just doesn't have enough grunt. Once the Raspberry Cade software that I'm using has been upgraded for the new Raspberry Pi, hopefully I'll be able to get some faster games running on it.
Well, that just about wraps it up for this episode of Vertical Hole.
And remember, if you like what you see, hit the subscribe button.